Hello everyone and welcome to See Through Panel. This is a comic book review and discussion podcast. My name is Fahed Rahman and today we are joined by Stephen Ingram. Stephen is a comic artist from Scotland. He has created the graphic novels Left and Holly and most recently published a one-shot horror comic called Old Man Grey. He also runs the indie comics publisher and distro ThirdBear Press. ThirdBear brings in English language indie comics from around the world to make them available in the UK and is currently open for submissions from the UK-based creators for Boxes, a new comics magazine. How are you doing, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm excited to be on. Yeah.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And the comic that we are going to be discussing is The Consultant. It's by Azam Raharjo. And I'll just read out the really brief summary that he's got on his website. A man discovers a horrifying secret during some small talk reminiscing with a co-worker. And this was originally made available as the Shortbox Comics Fair in 2022. So when I invite guests on, I asked them to select from another number of comics to discuss, and this one was your choice. So the first question is, what drew you to this particular comic?
Well, I suppose I hadn't read any of the comics that you'd pitched to me before, so I did a wee bit of research about all of them, and this one appealed to me the most because I really like that sort of short horror story that this one seemed to have like that kind of vibe to it, and also I really like the artwork, that kind of black and white sort of manga-like artwork, I suppose you would say it could be described as, and it's got that sort of Junji Ito horror vibe, which I really like. So that was definitely made me say I want to read that.
I want to talk a little bit about the creator. So the creator is Azam Raharjo. He's a comics artist and illustrator based in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and it was really interesting reading this comic with that information in the background, because when I originally looked at it, I thought, oh, this is like a manga comic, as you mentioned. It's got very manga influenced art style, and I think also the vibe is a very weird thing to say, but it had a very kind of like horror manga vibe.
Yeah, I get that. It's like that. Yeah, when I was saying it seemed quite influenced by like Junji Ito, and also like the art style reminded me a bit of Naoki Urasawa, who's not really, I suppose, known for horror comics, but it's that sort of the design of the characters made me think of his style a bit as well. And yeah, I really like that art style and how it gives the characters quite a lot of expression, I find, than what you might think is the more generic manga style. It gives them, you get a lot more expression out of the characters and that kind of art style.
For me, the weird thing it kind of sort of reminded me of was, I don't know if you've seen the anime Patlabor.
No, I haven't, but interestingly, someone mentioned that to me just a few days ago.
So it's an anime which is about police that ride in giant mechas, but it's very much as something as that can be based in like a reality of actually these mechas would probably be used to do industrial jobs like lifting things into buildings and that sort of stuff. But the way that Azam has designed his characters' faces reminded me a lot of that, because the character faces in Patlabor are really kind of like expressive and I wouldn't necessarily say realistically drawn, but kind of more on the realistic side of things. One of the kind of interesting things I found about the comic was at the start it kind of gave you instructions on how best to read it. Is that something you've come across before?
Yeah, it's not something I'd come across before. It was something that I'd noticed about this and thought that's a really interesting way of, I suppose, because it came out, it was like originally available through like the Shortbox Comic Fair, which was an all digital affair, and it's quite clear that this comic has been designed to be read as a PDF on your computer or on your iPad. And there's a bunch of things that I noticed when I was reading it. There was like, oh, that works really well because it's on a computer screen. And there was a bit, it's where the main character is watching the video sent by one of his colleagues, and interspersed between like each page, it's like one page is like a regular comic page, and then the next is like a black page with like a very indistinct picture of the consultant's face. And when you're skipping between the pages, I noticed that the image of the consultant's face sort of lingers in your vision as you're reading on to the next page. And I thought that's a really cool effect, that surely they've designed that to be in it, because it's primarily people are going to read it as a PDF, and you wouldn't get that in a print version. And it just really sort of blew my mind a little bit when reading reading it like that, we're just like, wow, they've really thought about this. This is great.
I mean, it was very, very clever. Many years ago, so I've written a comic, and it was originally designed to be a digital comic with kind of light animation effects. So say if we've got like we had a scene set in a hotel, and then one of the ideas was the city outside the hotel bedroom would be kind of like animated with like little, not necessarily gifs, but kind of like lights flashing to kind of indicate that their cars moving. And when you think about comics that have been designed specifically to be read digitally, a lot of it is focused on what can you do with like little bits of like animation or sound design. But doing something like this is actually really, really clever. It's kind of not something that I'd considered doing before. Just leaving a space for your mind to kind of like create really rather creepy image, just kind of as an after effect of having that faint outline of the face of the consultant.
That was something that I really enjoyed about when reading this comic. It was something that really made me, I suppose it's like thinking back to, I suppose, like the early days of webcomics as well. It was like people exploring a new space to do comic work like this. And back in like the early days of webcomics, people like experimenting with like infinite canvas of reading pages just like as one giant sheet, and you're just moving around the page like that. This kind of speaks to me as the same kind of experimentation that is really impressive. It's not just doing but it's still working in a way that if like you were to do a print version of it, you could maybe do something to maybe try and replicate it. I don't know how it would work. Maybe have like the consultant's face on a bit of tracing paper and on between each page, maybe
something like that. But I mean, it's kind of like, I don't want this to sound like it's a gimmick thing, because it's not. It perfectly helps tell the story that he's trying to tell, I think. And a lot of times people have guests come on my podcast, and I ask them the question, why comics? And often we talk about the form. I don't think that this story could be told as well in any other format as well as it's done except as a digital comic, if that makes sense. I think it's kind of like perfectly suited to this. So we haven't actually talked much about the comics plot itself. I don't want to get too much into spoiler territory, because it's kind of obviously it's a horror comic, and part of the fun is like discovering what horrible things happen to the characters. There's kind of two main characters. ThirdBear, who is this kind of, I wouldn't say schlubby, but he's this portly guy that works for a company. I don't think we're ever actually told what the company does apart from various.
I think they're like a sort of generic company, but they've just moved into restaurants. But this is the first restaurant they've done. I think that's right. And everything, but anything else they've done is just left our imagination, as far as I could get.
And kind of like the key core of the book is around conversation that ThirdBear has with his co-worker Surayo. He just kind of off the cuff asks him, "Who's that fella in the background of all these company photos? I never see him around the office." And that just kicks off a chain of events. I really like the way that Azam has described the comic in his blurb. A man discovers a horrifying secret during during some small talks. Probably how a lot of horrifying secrets are discovered. I think.
Just like a passing mention of something, and then it's like, hang on, I thought about that, and that's weird.
One of the things I really liked about the comic was the way he really establishes like the characters really quickly. Kind of within like 2 or 3 pages, we actually understand who these people are, what their relationship is to each other, and kind of what the likely relationship is going to be to the other characters in the comic. How do you feel? Do you think that's correct, or did you feel like you needed a little bit more time to kind of get to know who each of these characters were?
No, I'd agree with that. I think when you look at ThirdBear, I suppose it's like a really well designed character where you can just take in, I suppose, a bunch of cliches about that kind of character that he is, which is like maybe sort of middle-aged guy who's worked for a company for a long time and is quite settled in his little role in the company. And so that you kind of get his character quite quickly from that. Just the sort of, because he's, like you said, sort of schlubby, I guess you could describe his design as. It gives him a more like he's settled in his role and is filled out in it, I guess you could say. And with the other guy, Suryo, he's got a bit more sort of the kind of young, dynamic up-and-comer about him, and you can tell that straight away. Particularly, I suppose, that he's wanting to, you'd say, because he's wanting to like ask this more experienced member of the team who that person is in the photograph, and it's almost, you could imagine that he's asking because he wants to know who it is, so that he can make more connections to move up in the company. You could maybe say like that would be something to read into like that whole conversation that they have.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's you can learn a lot about those two characters just from those 3 or 4 pages of them talking at the beginning, and then the story moves on.
I think it's quite good that Azam gave kind of instructions on how to read the comic. So the instructions are the best way to read this is kind of like one page at a time, and I think that's probably helped him kind of lay out panels as well. I think it's sometimes when you're working on like a 2-page spread, certainly when I'm writing it, sometimes you're quite often thinking about how much information can I put on this page that won't necessarily spill over into the other page, or do I want 2-page splashing, that sort of thing. So I think him having made the decision, all right, I'm just going to be displaying this information on one page. This is how much space that I've got to work with. And I think that's really helped with some of his storytelling decisions in terms of the panels that he uses, and especially some of the angles that he uses as well. I'm just looking at one of the first pages where he's taking this kind of like fish-eyed, is that the right word, where it's kind of like you're looking out from like Photo's point of view at Ferdy and Suryo, and kind of like their point. And I think that's maybe one of my favorite panels in the comic.
I'm looking at it now as well, and I can see what you mean. It's almost like we're looking out of the picture from the consultant's point of view in the picture, so like he's looking out at them as well as them looking out at him.
What did you think about the dialogue? Because I was going on I went to Azam's website, and one of the things it said it was available in like 4 different languages. So I think I don't know if he translated it himself, but I think if he did, he's done like an amazing job, because like the dialogue is superb. It doesn't, sometimes when you get translated stuff, interpreting what kind of different phrases means, stuff like that can make it sound like a little bit wooden. This kind of like the dialogue in this kind of just like flowed beautifully. It wouldn't be out of place in like an American movie.
I never noticed anything like untoward about the dialogue. I didn't realize it was available in the other languages, and it might have been a translation. It just seemed like it would naturally be read in English, so I wasn't like I never thought that seems a bit stilted or anything. It just felt pretty natural to me.
Just one last thing I wanted to talk about. So the comic is mostly in black and white, but then he does occasionally use red in certain sections. How did you feel about that, his decision to kind of do that?
I think it's quite an effective tool to use, particularly obviously it's red, so spoiler alert, it's some blood, I guess. And it's quite effective in that if it was just kept in black and white, I think it would, like, blood would probably be black, and so it would probably get lost in some of the artwork. So using, like, having the option to use a bit of red, which I suppose can be a decision, particularly if you're going to be printing it, but that's not been the case with this one, because I think it's primarily for a digital comic. Then using the red is an effective decision. And also, unlike, because we talked about before about having the bits where there's like the sort of image of the consultant's face that you're getting the sort of image of when you're flicking through the pages, that's also in red as well. Tying the consultant's image to the red blood is also a good way of tying those kind of things together, the kind of horror elements of like this sort of supernatural consultant and the real world blood, and they're tied together by this colour, which I thought was quite good.
I think there's a lot of kind of really good creative decisions made there. Is there anything about the comic that we haven't discussed that you wanted to kind of like talk about?
I suppose like I'd made a few notes and things, but if we're not going to be going into any spoiler territory, then they're all I probably can't really talk about them a lot. I suppose are you happy talking about like
general themes? I think is fine. In terms of spoilers, I'd mean like which characters survive sort of thing. I think is kind of like areas that I would want to stay away from. But in terms of like general themes, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, because one of the sort of themes that I think I noticed through it was it's like the sort of food cycle and the nutrient cycle that we humans might assume we're top of the food chain, and there's lots of images through the comic of like worms and maggots and those creatures that we would associate with like picking over dead bodies to get like the nutrients out of them, and then they're returned to the soil and then the soil is used to grow our food, and then we eat the food, and then it becomes a more cycle. And with like the consultant and thing that sort of entity represents, it suggests that maybe we're not top of the food chain, but something else is top of the food chain, and the order of the food chain is maybe moved one step further along from what I got out of the comic. Yeah, that the consultants entities are they're one step ahead of us in the food chain, and which I thought was it's quite a cool idea that to base a horror on. It's like questioning humans' place in the order of things.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other thing that I kind of quite liked about the comic is that it left a lot of questions unanswered. We never really get an idea of what the consultant is, what the consultant actually wants, price the company's paying to the consultant, or indeed why the characters that do die. There's no those characters obviously did something wrong. We never get there was a misstep somewhere. It's kind of so that's the other thing that I also quite enjoyed. And I think the other thing that I the other kind of theme, kind of something that you sort of raised when you were describing 30 is like, this person is kind of quite set in their ways, and people who are quite set in their ways don't really often question why certain things are the way that they are. And until kind of like something happens to awaken them.
You kind of wonder whether he might have noticed some things in the past, but then just sort of went, that's just how it is, and then continued on until something happened to someone that he cares about, but is someone he's worked closely with, I guess. Because you get the idea it's a fairly large company that they work for. I think that's probably
a question that neither of us are going to be able to answer, is kind of like what the work, because I'm assuming this comic is sent in Indonesia, because that's where Azam is from. It's kind of like what the work culture is like in Indonesia. Is it closer to Western work culture, or is it closer to kind of like Japanese work? Because when I originally read this, I just thought, okay, this is like a Japanese manga horror comic, until I'd read like Azam's bio. So okay, obviously it's probably set in Indonesia, and maybe there's like some cultural things that we're missing out on.
We might not get some of the things in it. But I suppose looking at a lot of the character designs, you'd probably say Indonesia would be like Singapore, that sort of area. You would suggest that some of the characters are from that area.
Yeah, certainly. I really enjoyed this. I'd highly recommend it. I'm not too sure if it's still available on Shortbox, but I'd highly recommend everyone who's interested in horror comics check this out, especially if you're a fan, as you mentioned, of like Junji Ito and kind of movies of Japanese horror movies like The Ring and stuff like that, where there's this kind of like creeping sense of something's gone horribly wrong, but we don't quite know what it is. This isn't a comic full of like jump scares and stuff like that. It's very much more about the mood and the vibe of the story.
You can have like a creeping sense of unease while you're reading it, which is a fun feeling to have, I guess.
And would you recommend this one as well?
Totally, yes. I think it's great. I was really pleased that I got to read it. It's really good. I was looking about whether it was how it was going to be available after the short box event, because I think I read that it's going to be on Asam's website if it's not already, so you could probably get it through there.
Definitely check it out. If I find a link on how to buy it, I'll definitely put it in the podcast description. So Stephen, let's talk a little bit about you. I like to ask a few kind of like standard, like generic questions when I have a guest on, and kind of like one of the first ones I typically ask is, why comics?
Why comics?
It's a big question.
It's a big question. I'd say I make comics because, well, I suppose like way back, I really enjoyed drawing, and then I sort of got into comics through like gag strips and things, and then gradually started making more longer form, serious kind of work that I do now. And why comics? I think maybe I preferred like from a writing point of view, and if I prefer like writing dialogue than big descriptions of things, because I suppose a lot of you would maybe say, why would you draw a panel with like a bunch of people in it when you could just write there was a group of people and continue on with your novel? But I like the drawing part of it. The drawing part of it's like the thing that like I really enjoy about comics, as well as I enjoy writing, but it's more the drawing part that I enjoy better. And I like telling stories. So it kind of marries together. Enjoy the drawing, enjoy the telling stories. So comics is the best way to do it for me.
I think that's quite a common answer, is like people being drawn to the art and then kind of like finding that's the best way that they can express themselves. Growing up, what sort of comics did you read? Was it kind of Marvel, DC, or was it kind of like Beano? Kind of what was your kind of that first memories around that?
Yeah, I would get like the Beano and occasionally the Dandy, but I was definitely more a Beano kid than a Dandy kid. And I also would sometimes get like the Real Ghostbusters magazine, which had some fun comics in it. I suppose like the comics that maybe had like more of an influence on me at the time was like the newspaper gag strips, like Garfield and especially Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so that's what kind of like got me into comics. Because I know it was never really read Marvel or DC or the kind of superhero comics that were available at the time. So yeah, it was gag strips that really got me into comics. And then I kind of discovered longer form story comics later on in life. Like the kind of comics that really turned me on to wanting to do kind of longer form stuff was I found a copy of The Iron Wagon by the Norwegian artist Jason.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Jason. I'm not too sure if I've read the Iron Wagon or not though.
Yeah, I think you can. I don't think you can get it as like a standalone book anymore, but it's in his collection What I Did, and it's really good. It's like that's a book that I read and thought I could do that. This is what I should be doing, rather than gag strips that aren't that funny. So yeah, it was like that made me think, yeah, that's what I want to do, and then worked out my own storytelling style and techniques and built from there to what I do now.
I mean, it's kind of interesting you mentioned like you mentioned Jason, because he does do a lot of long form storytelling, but the way he lays out his comics it also really works very well for like gag. Sometimes he'll just do like a page where it's a gag comic within like his longer form work. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of, his books is the thing that kind of kicked off in your head that, all right, I can take the short stuff that I'm doing and kind of maybe turn it into kind of longer form stuff as well.
Because like that at that point I think I was wanting to try things that would elicit more of a emotional response than a laughing response. So his work really spoke to me at that time.
I mean, well, you did mention kind of like Calvin and Hobbes as one of your inspirations, and some of those weren't necessarily laugh out loud. They're more philosophical, totally. Kind of that sort of thing. But
some of them hit quite hard.
Jason does have because from what I gather, you do write like a lot of horror inspired stuff in there. I wouldn't say necessarily Jason stuff horror inspired, but there is like that sense of unease about the world in which it's a weird world. It's quite aside the fact that it's like anthropomorphic animals. There's something odd about the world in which he sets his stories.
Yeah, and it's kind of like also the way that he draws his characters. They've all got like pretty standard expressions on their faces. But because from context, you can still realize the emotions that those characters are going through, even though they've just got a fairly blank stare on their face. You're thinking they've got stuff going on in their head. And I quite like that from him. It's being able to look at his artwork and infer what he's thinking with the characters.
It's kind of that the act of interpreting kind of, what's happened here, and I completely get. One of the other questions I want to kind of get out of the way quite early. You've started ThirdBear Press, so like one of the obvious questions is like, why have you named it that?
Good question. ThirdBear is the ThirdBear is a character that used to appear very occasionally in some old comics that I did, and I quite like the character's design. And I've always kind of like used that as like a little name some places online. And yeah, I quite like the name. And I like the look of the character. And he looks quite nice as a logo. So I thought, it's something that harks back to my early creative comics and also brings it up to date to what I do now, I think. So that was like a good idea for me personally to name my wee publisher / distro after something that I used to do ages ago.
And why start a publishing house slash distro? It seems like an awful lot of hard work. And kind of like, I just love that. Why? Why?
Why would you do this? Why? Also a good question. I suppose with like the distro side of it, what I've been doing is bringing in indie comics from around the world. I suppose primarily from like the States at the moment, to make them available over here, because there's like a lot of work done by either individual artists or small publishers you simply just can't really get over here. There's maybe like 1 or 2 shops that might bring some in, but only in like a few 5 copies or something, and then they're gone and they never come back in. And so our option over here was either to just go to those artists and publishers in the States and try and buy a single copy, or and pay tons of shipping, particularly as it is just now. Or my thoughts were, if I can get like say 10 copies at wholesale price and the shipping's not that much more expensive than just buying one, then I can sell them over here and people over here will be able to get them for a lot cheaper as well. And there's good comics over there that I think should be available over here. So that was my thought process of doing it. And got a little bit of time at the moment, so I figured, why not? I should do this right now and set up a wee shop for it. And it's been going all right so far. I've also taken them to a few like in-person shows as well. I didn't have any at Thought Bubble, but I had some at Edinburgh Comic Art Festival last month, and it's also got quite a good response from people going, oh, it's exciting that we can get this work over here now. That was my thought process through it, and it's something that I would want, if I wasn't doing it myself, I would be wanting someone else to do it. So yeah.
How long did it kind of like take from like the initial idea for you to kind of set up ThirdBear Press to kind of like it getting off the ground and having the shop front and stuff like that? Was this something that happened quite quickly, or was this an idea percolating in the back of your head for some time?
I mean, I've had the sort of idea for a little while, but then I sort of bit the bullet and started putting stuff in place for it in the summer, and then launched it beginning of September, I think it was. So it was just getting stuff started and getting it, like the shop open and books online, wasn't actually that far away. But from thinking about it, I suppose, was from a while back. So yeah, but once I actually made the mind up to do it, it was fairly quick to set up.
And I also kind of like wanted to ask you about, obviously you're distributing comics, you're publishing comics. I assume you get kind of getting submissions. Is that the case at the moment? You're kind of like getting submissions from like American public. Okay, cool.
Well, it's not from the submissions I've got open at the moment. Through ThirdBear, I wanted to do some publishing of other people's work as well, but primarily UK-based artists. So what I'm planning to do is start a new comic magazine. I'm calling it Boxes, and it's currently open for submissions at the moment. Not sure when this podcast will go out, but submissions are open until the 31st of December 2022. Okay. So there's a few weeks left as of recording. And the idea behind it is to have a sort of anthology, but it's really more a magazine, you would say, with like some articles about comic and also lots of short stories from artists that I'm looking for submissions for. So like ones that are like 1 to 8 pages long per each artist submission.
Has that kind of like getting submissions in and stuff like that, has that given you any insight in maybe why other publishers publish the comics that they do, and how do you feel about saying no to your kind of like your fellow creative art, comic book artists out there's like, it's not the right thing, or that sort of stuff? How's that kind of like changed the way that you've kind of looked at the stuff that you're creating as well?
Yeah, I suppose like when it comes to like rejecting submissions and things, I suppose I've got reasonable idea of what I want the magazine to be like, but I suppose like it might be either dictated a little bit by the submissions that I get, but during this like process of deciding which ones I want to have in the magazine, which ones I don't want to have in the magazine, it'll be like an interesting editorial process for me to go through, saying, right, these comics fit together quite nicely into a cohesive whole for this issue of the magazine. Yeah, it'll be an interesting creative process. But I think for like saying no to like someone who sent in a submission, I mean, I've obviously like sent stuff into people before and been knocked back, and it's horrible. It can be hard. It can be hard. particularly if it's something that you felt was particularly good yourself.
Yeah.
I know how that felt in the past, and I think it'll be like being able to let people down gently and say, but that it's not a fit for this, but it will be either might be a fit for something in the future or a season. I will always try and I think say either why it's being rejected or that like this isn't the end of the road. I'd still like to hear stuff from you in the future, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I would always. I think I would always want to give some feedback because I've been on the other side.
In terms of the comics that you are selecting for distribution, what is the process for that? Is that just you going online and doing research in terms of what this guy looks like an amazing creator, his their books should be available in the UK, or how does that process work?
Yeah, I've been looking for books for the distro. I've been when I first was starring it, there was some books I'd come across in the past that I thought I'd really like to get something from those publishers like Kilgore and the Silver Sprocket as well. Those are two that I'd come across in the past. I thought I'm going to get stuff from them. But some of the other ones that I found was through, there was the SPX exhibition earlier this year.
Yeah.
Part of it was I kind of went through the exhibitor list from that and just had a look through. I thought, oh, that looks interesting. I'll get in touch with them. And there's been some that, I've sent an email off. I never heard anything back. But some, they came back to me and then we had a wee chat. And then I ordered some books from them and got them sent over. And we kind of worked something out, a deal to get things over. So it's an interesting process. And also some people was ones that people have recommended stuff to me and said, oh, you should look into this one. Either they'd I think one of my friends had been over at TCA, the Toronto Comic Art Festival, and he gave me a list of books, a list of creators that I should get in contact with because he'd seen their stuff and it's really good. You should have a look at this. And it's not really available in the UK, so get on it. I was like, all right, I'll have a look. And there's been a few of them I've been in touch with as well and got some of their books over. So it's. But if there's anyone listening who's got an interesting book from outside the UK that's not really available here, give me a shout and we'll see what we can do.
Oddly enough, we do have a lot of our listeners are in the United States. I think that's partly because Cole's based there, but we do have a fair few listeners in Russia as well. So you might be getting some English language
interesting
comics from people based in Russia, hopefully, maybe. So I wanted to talk a little bit kind of about you and kind of your creative process. So you've decided to create a comic book. How does that start? Do you start with a fully written out script, or do you start with a basic idea, then do thumbnail sketches and then script it in afterwards? How does that process work?
It starts off with the kind of basic idea, and if I've got a full script, a sort of full story idea in my mind, I'll write out a basic synopsis for it, and then I would then sort of have a look at it and decide on what I want the characters to be like. I do have a sketchbook with characters that are just drawn in the book and then sort of left in there. And so if I'm struggling for what I want a character to look like, I'll often have a look back through that and then decide that, that one looks like the right kind of fit for this one. Or I'll decide if I could change this bit about that particular character that I've drawn in there, and then that would fit in there. But in terms of writing the comics, I've always got an end point in mind, but I often feel like I kind of go with the flow from the beginning and then feel my way towards the end, particularly if it's something that's in chapters. When I was doing the comic Left, I always had the idea, the last issue in mind, that I knew that was where it was going. But from the start point to the end point, it was released over 9 issues, and there was lots of deviations and different paths taken through that book. That if I was just doing it as, I suppose, one volume that I was releasing by itself without doing any issues, I probably would have had a more straight line from the beginning to the end, rather than a more meandering story that one took. And when I was doing Holly, which is my graphic novel after Left, that was a much more kind of freewheeling writing process, because I'd drawn like a picture of the main character, Holly, before I knew she was a main character. And she was just kind of like standing on a cliff, throwing rocks at the water. And I'd really like the kind of vibe of that picture. It's kind of like you look at the picture and it's just like you kind of get a good sense of that character straight away. Kind of like how we got a good sense of the characters in The Consultant from a really like quick couple of pages.
Yeah.
From this like one image that I'd drawn of Holly, I knew who she was and I wanted to tell her story. So the kind of writing process for that started when I'd got this picture of her and said, right, what's she going to do? And I just started writing a script that followed her around to see what she was doing and what she would do. And that script formed like the basis of the first chapter of the book. And it was just a good writing exercise to get to know the character really well. And then that was a building block that I built the whole book on, because then you discovered her motivations through that initial writing exercise. And then through those motivations, you had what she wanted to do in the book and what story she wanted to take and how that would work. So yeah, that was when I'm looking at writing, how I write, I've used different techniques, I suppose, for everything that I've done so far. I don't really have like a set rules, like this is how I do it.
Okay. I mean, that is fascinating because a lot of people do have like a set routine, kind of like, right, this is when I'm going to write, this is how I'm going to write, this is how I'm going to draw. So like for you, it's kind of, it changes maybe from like project.
I think it changes
to project a little bit.
With like the difference between like, say, my book Holly and like Old Man Grey, which is the latest comic, is that Holly is more like a character piece, as in like it's a book that's totally focused on this one character and their story and like her like emotional story through her making the decisions about her future. Whereas like Old Man Grey, that had a much more, because it's a short 24-page horror story, it's got a bit more of a structure to it. And so I was thinking much more about telling a story in a tight way. Like one of my friends who read it said there's no fat on that story. Yeah, which is a nice thing to hear.
Comment to hear.
But it's also I suppose like I'd worried it felt a bit slight, but it's actually told in a concise way. Whereas Holly, I suppose, isn't told in a concise way. It's a much more meandering kind of tale. But that's works for that story, I think. So yeah.
In terms of drawing, what is your process? Do you work with paper, digital, analog tools, digital tools? Do you have a home studio? Do you work at home? Do you work in a studio? Kind of when you actually sit down to draw the thing, how do you draw?
I've got like a
kind of do
your room and a drawing desk here at home that I use to draw at. And when I'm doing comic pages, I work with pen and paper. It's like I've been mainly using like a Kuretake brush pen for my artwork for the last wee while. And before that, I'd used like fine liners. But I've always worked for the line art, been doing that like analog on pen and paper, and then any colouring is done like on the computer. So yeah, I definitely much prefer the tactile nature of working with pen and ink on Bristol board. Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating because like just about every artist I've spoken to is working digitally because it's just more convenient. Like the workflows, the ability to kind of erase mistakes and stuff like that. Kind of like there is something very permanent about working with pen and paper and ink. It's kind of like it's more difficult to deal with, like not necessarily missteps.
You've got to know what you're putting down on the paper. You can't just like.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've got to work it out in a sketchbook first before you start working on the actual page. Yeah. I don't know. I kind of.
Is that stressful?
That's because this is how I've always done it, and that's just how I do it. Yeah. But although I did try and I've tried to like draw on my iPad. But I've done some. I'm happy to do like coloring on the iPad, but doing the actual artwork, I struggled with it. So I think maybe it's because you're able to zoom in so much and then zoom out. I find that difficult to deal with, whereas I'm used to just having a page in front of me that doesn't change size, and then
I do find it fascinating how different artists create. I've had artists that work on their iPad, and some of them, I had one of my early guests. He said, sometimes if the weather's nice, I'll take my iPad, I'll go out to the park and sit underneath a tree and do my work there. Mm-hmm. And then some people like to sit in their bed and have like Netflix on in the background or music playing. Is there anything on in the background while you're working, or is it silence, or how does that tend to work?
I've usually got something on. It's usually either music or a podcast or something.
Okay, cool. What type of music? What type of podcast?
I find like with
listening to
for music, I quite like the instrumental music for when I'm working, because then there's like no words going round in your head. So I've been listening to a lot of like atmospheric synth music. Kind of a tongue around that one. So like dungeon synth kind of music. It's got a bit of like fantasy atmosphere to it, even though that's not the kind of like comics that I make. But it's so that kind of like dungeon synth kind of music or instrumental music like Mogwai or Godspeed You Black Emperor or something. It's so that there's just some kind of like noise going on while I'm working, rather than just like cars going past outside. Or I find that like I can't really work with a film on, because I'm always wanting to look at it. I struggle with like just having a film on and not watching it. So I definitely like would have a bit of music and do some drawing.
Okay, that's fascinating. When you're choosing the music that you're drawing to, do you kind of like choose like something that's got a similar vibe to the page that you're drawing, or is that kind of like
it's not, I suppose that's not relevant. I just listen to stuff that I like. It's not necessarily, this is a sad page, I'll put on something that's sad. I get it.
A lot of people do. Kind of a lot of people. It's kind of like, let me get into this. Like, really,
I get it. You want to like get into the emotional space of the page, but that's not really something that works for me.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. I'm just wary of the time. I want to ask you a couple of more questions before I let you go. Let me ask this kind of like it's quite a big question. What does success look like for you? And you can take that however you want, in terms of like wider life goals, or just in terms of like your comic creating
right. I think
process.
I'll take the question in a have I made a good comic way, rather than monetary success way, which is who knows what that looks like. But have I made a good comic? I think I've made a good comic if someone reads it and they've found that they've engaged with the characters, have felt something while they're reading it, whether it's I was scared by this, or I didn't like this, or whether it's I really liked this, or I really loved the characters, or I really enjoyed the story. And then I suppose why I'm looking for when I'm creating a comic is that someone feels something when they've read it, and it's what I look for when I'm reading someone else's work. I want to have felt something when I was reading it. So that's my goals, to make people feel something.
Okay, just to get an emotional reaction. And the last couple of questions is there anything that you want to plug on the podcast? I know you mentioned the submission window for ThirdBear Press. Is there any kind of like crowdfunders, comics, any other projects that you want to put out there?
I suppose I don't actually have any. I've got like the submissions for boxes, which obviously like my big thing at the moment. I'm looking for. I suppose if people are interested in my work, they can get Holly and Old Man Grey are available on like the ThirdBear Press shop, along with a bunch of other interesting comics as well. So if you wanted to pick up some of my work along with some cool US indie comics, then that would be great.
And the last question I always ask at the end of these, well, the second to last question I always usually ask is there anything that I haven't asked or we haven't talked about that you'd like to discuss?
Oh, good. I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Okay, cool. Can you tell everyone where they can find you and ThirdBear Press online, social media, Twitter, website, all that good stuff?
Sure, they can find stuff about my work. My website is stepheningram.art. That's, Stephen with a V. So stepheningram.art. And my social medias for that, they're all at Stephen Ingram Art on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And for ThirdBear Press, you can find out about that on thirdbearpress.com, and the social medias for that are at ThirdBear Press on Twitter.
That's great.
Instagram,
Thank you so
Facebook
much for taking time out of your day to come on the pod. Guys, if you can please continue to support the podcast by leaving a rating or review wherever you found us. There is a link to our tip jar in the episode description. If you can drop a few coins there, that helps keep the lights on for us. Cole is continuing to do some fantastic work over on our YouTube channel in terms of, they're not necessarily reviews, but just kind of him highlighting books that he's read and why he enjoys the art in some of them. That's it, guys. If you've got any comments that you want to send us, you can email us at seafoodpanel@gmail.com. Stephen, let's say bye to everyone.
Yeah, bye.